Okay, good evening and welcome to the Shrewsbury Historical Society. Before we begin tonight, could we have a moment of silence for Gretchen Joliker, who passed away last week? Thank you. This is our November 2020 presentation. And before we begin, I'd like to remind everyone that we have started the new year and it's time to pay your dues. Thank you very much. We will cover both the curator's report and our treasurer's report at our next meeting on December 16th. Thank you. We will have Christine Gustafson talk about our 2 scholarships that we have. Christine?
Hi. As part of our outreach to the community, the Shrewsbury Historical Society presented 2 scholarships. The Shrewsbury Historical Society Stephen Porter Scholarship is awarded in memory of Stephen Porter, a longtime member who was actively involved in the restoration of the District No. 5 schoolhouse. This scholarship was awarded to Sean McQuaid, who is attending the University of Massachusetts Amherst Commonwealth Honors College. The Shrewsbury Historical Society Jean McDonald Graham Scholarship is awarded in memory of Jean McDonald Graham, a longtime member who was dedicated to educating students about local history. This scholarship was awarded to Safana Norwes, who is attending Vassar College. In addition to their outstanding academic and athletic accomplishments, both recipients were members of the National Social Studies Honor Society at Shrewsbury High School. Good luck in college, both of you.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, tonight, Shrewsbury Historical Society presents Short Skirts, Oh My, History of Women's Rights by Ann Barrett. Shrewsbury channels 28 and 328 and the shrewsburymediaconnection.org. About the presentation, when Abigail Adams begged her husband to remember the ladies in drafting a new code of laws, John wrote back that he could not but laughed at an extraordinary suggestion. Less than 150 years later, women would be working, voting, and experiencing the first taste of freedoms unheard of just a generation earlier. This lecture traces the exciting social and historical milestones in the fight for women's rights. About the presenter, Anne enjoys entertaining audiences with her lectures on historical topics. She's vice president of the Topsfield Historical Society and publisher of the newsletter Local Lore. She is also a member of the Daughters of the American Revolution and was awarded Storyteller of the Year by the North Boston Convention and Visitors Bureau for her collaboration with the North Shore Music Theater and developing the groundbreaking Spotlight on History series. Thank you very much, Anne.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me into your homes, into your kitchens or living rooms or wherever I'm going to be visiting with you this evening. I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen, and then we will begin. The 1920s represented an exciting new time for women, with new freedoms and opportunities so greatly expanded from anything that women had ever experienced before, and that could not have been imagined by their grandmothers or possibly even their mothers. In the 1920s, conservative opinion proclaimed loudly that women had changed, become something completely different from what they had always been. Women, they said, were at the vortex of a fiery revolution, part of the new flaming youth. They bobbed their hair, shortened their skirts, carried flasks in their garters, and danced to the wee hours of the morning. In general, they thumbed their noses at the dull, conventional worlds of their mothers and turned their backs on good old American virtues. These are easy generalizations that have been passed down to us, but like lots of sweeping characterizations like this, they're only part of the story. One essential correction is this oversimplification and this view of the out of control female and how it might have suddenly started. It didn't begin with the invention of the rumble seat and its purported uses, nor was it the consequence simply of the 19th Amendment giving women the right to vote. American women had been changing. Yes, more rapidly in the decade previous, but really for much longer. For decades, women had been seeing themselves in a new light and had been seeking a place for themselves, a different, new place for themselves in the scheme of things, in society. So tonight, we're going to journey through the decades leading up to this time. And we're going to go back in time and start at a time when skirts were long, opportunities were short, and women had not yet begun to realize their dreams. Excuse me for just a second. Sometimes sharing does not work as well as we would like it to. In 1776, Abigail Adams is known to have written to her husband John, then attending the Continental Congress. And she said, "I long to hear that you have declared an independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you would remember the ladies and be more favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could." John wrote back, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh." But John did go on to admit that women wielded much more power than perhaps was acknowledged, and went on further to say, and why would we codify that which is already in many respects true? Rights for women were exceedingly limited. Before the Married Women's Property Act of 1848, a woman could not control property, income, or anything like that, even if it had belonged to her before marriage. Once she married, all of her assets, income, her very person, the persons of any children that she had by a prior marriage, the control of all of that passed to her husband. And unfortunately, women discovered belatedly that it was more their wealth that had attracted their new husband than themselves. Of course, there were always exceptions. As a single woman of property in Maryland in the mid-18th century, Margaret Brent, who is pictured here in a woodcut on the left. Well, Margaret went to the provincial court to press suits against debtors and such. She also represented her brother Giles in court. She was a controversial but very wealthy figure, and there are probably women, other women, that we just don't hear about here and there throughout history. In 1756, Lydia Taft became the first woman legally allowed to vote in colonial America. Her husband died and her son died, and that left the family with no legal representation in terms of voting. And so the town of Uxbridge, Massachusetts, voted to allow her to represent the family in voting. Deborah Sampson, pictured on the right, of Plimpton, Massachusetts, she took a different approach to the challenges, let's say, of being a woman in a man's world. She disguised herself as a young man, dressed herself in a uniform, and presented herself for enlistment during the Revolutionary War as Robert Shirtliff. She was wounded several times, but managed to escape detection. And it wasn't until she contracted brain fever that the attending physician discovered her secret. But rather than disclose that, he had her moved to private quarters and nursed her back to health. And it's said that she received a soldier's pension signed off on by George Washington at the conclusion of the Revolution. Education for women took place in their homes and on a limited basis in schools. And I say a limited basis because, for example, Susan B. Anthony was not allowed to study certain subjects when she attended school because of her gender. We're all familiar with the image here, the quintessential sampler, which allowed young girls, to learn their letters and their numbers, and also at the same time to practice the all-important skill of fine needlework. Women were provided an education basically with the idea or the thought that they would be providing rudimentary education to their own children, reading, writing, some basic figuring. And then depending upon the family's circumstances, the boys might go on to further education in formal schools. It would later be written that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object establishing a complete tyranny over her. Limited education had historically been a large part of that tyranny. However, in 1821, the Troy Female Seminary, the first endowed school for women, was founded in New York by Emma Willard. Emma was already a successful teacher and administrator when she wrote a pamphlet entitled A Plan for Improving Female Education. And in this pamphlet, she laid out the many benefits that society as a whole would reap with the better education of women. She petitioned the state of New York for funds to establish a school, but the state declined. However, the city of Troy, New York, raised those funds. They raised $4,000 and agreed to establish a school if Emma would come to run that school, which she did. She established the school with an education that offered education comparable to that which would be college preparatory for boys of the time. And it included courses such as zoology and natural history and chemistry and such. Now, Emma knew that many of her students would also be going on to run homes and be wives, and so she also included courses in home management and home economics. If she couldn't find a particular textbook that suited her needs or her desires for a particular course, she wrote them herself. And as a matter of fact, I discovered in my own library that has been passed down through several generations of my family, I discovered just such a book. It is An Abridged History of the United States of the Republic of America by Emma Willard, 1845. So this is one of those textbooks that she wrote. The Troy Female Seminary became a model for comprehensive education of women. It also proved that women had the ability to learn and to excel in all subjects, contrary to what many people believed at that time and even later on. In his 1873 book, Sex and Education, Dr. Edward Clark put forth the premise that a girl can study and learn, but cannot do all this and retain uninjured health and a future secure from neuralgia, uterine disease, hysteria, and other derangements of the nervous system. In 1833, Oberlin College became the first coeducational college in the United States. As we all know, knowledge is power, and women were making the first steps in a powerful journey that would take them to places that perhaps the early women of this journey would never have even imagined. At about the same time, in publishing the book Course of Popular Lectures, Fanny Wright, pictured here, became one of the first women to actually write about suffrage, to actually write and put down on paper for all to see the idea that women should be able to vote. She was from Scotland, and she moved to the United States to found a socialist colony on land that she had purchased in Tennessee, based upon a model of a socialist colony that she had observed in Indiana. Wright was a correspondent. She was a luminary. She was a guest of a luminary such as Thomas Jefferson and the Marquis de Lafayette. She was the first woman to edit a journal, the Harmony Gazette. And she was the first woman to hold a series of popular lectures before a mixed audience, both men and women. It was unheard of at that time for women to make public address, and even more especially, women to make public address before an audience of both males and females. Some aspects of Wright's community were extremely controversial, especially her decision to encourage sexual freedom. Wright saw marriage as a discriminatory institution, and she advocated for free love long before the 1960s. Wright also developed her own dress code for women that included a bodice, a knee-length skirt, and then ankle-length pantalettes, kind of like what the women wore bloomers, in the later part of that century. In her book, she wrote, "However novel it may appear, I shall venture the assertion that until women assume the place in society which good sense and good feeling alike assign to them, human improvement can advance but feebly. It is in vain that we would circumscribe the power of one half of our race, and that half by far the most important and influential." In 1840, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, pictured on the left and right, met at an international anti-slavery convention in London, where they were outraged when the men of the assembly voted to prevent women attendees from speaking at the assembly or even being seen. They actually created a cordoned off area behind a curtain so that the women could view the proceedings but not be seen. Now, these women were actually sent as full-fledged delegates to this convention, and yet they were still denied the opportunity to speak or even be seen. Well, this galvanized these two ladies into further action regarding women's rights. And so, in 1848, the first Women's Rights Convention in the United States was held in Seneca Falls, New York, organized by Stanton, Mott, and several other women. Many of the participants signed a declaration of sentiments and resolutions which outlined the main issues and goals for this emerging women's movement. So I actually have the document here, and I just want to share a little bit of it with you. "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these rights, it is the right of those who suffer from it to refuse allegiance to it, and to insist upon the institution of a new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpation on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He closes against her all the avenues to wealth and distinction which he considers most honorable to himself, As a teacher of theology, medicine, or law, she is not known. He has denied her the facilities for obtaining a thorough education, colleges being closed against her. He has usurped the prerogative of Jehovah himself, claiming it as his right to assign for her a sphere of action when that belongs to her conscience and her God. And so it goes on. This convention marked the beginning of regularly held women's rights meetings. It might be hard for us to imagine, but women organizing themselves and acting independently from men in this way was a totally new concept. Just remember that we had just said women were not even allowed to make public address. So to compare, for example, this book was published in 1848, the exact same year that first convention took place. This little book focuses, some chapters of it focus on the behavior of women, because up until that time, with a few exceptions, some of the breakaway women that we've discussed here, but generally up until that time, women had really only their appearance, behavior, and reputation to rely upon to get them through in life. For example, according to this little tome, a lady's behavior in the street should be modest, dignified, yet pleasant and engaging. Never stare, never giggle, never walk with a wriggle or sway from side to side. Ladies are not allowed upon any ordinary occasion to take the arm of anyone but a male relative or an accepted suitor. A question from a stranger, beyond the most necessary of questions, a question from a stranger should be considered a gross insult and repelled with proper spirit. The Civil War disrupted many suffrage activities as women turned their energies to war work. They served as nurses and fundraisers, a few as spies, and even a few in disguise again as soldiers. As well, they were running households and businesses and farms while their husbands and sons and fathers were away at war for months or years. But this war work provided a training ground for many women to learn organizational and occupational skills. Many would later take what they learned and put it towards the suffrage cause. In 1870, the 15th Amendment gave the right to vote to the Black male population. Disagreement over this amendment caused a split in the American Equal Rights Association that had been formed in 1866. This association was really bent on getting the vote for Black men and Black women and white women. And so when only Black men were given the vote, a lot of disagreement about how to move forward took place, and the organization split in two. Katie Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the National Women's Suffrage Association. These women worked very well together. They didn't always agree, but it is said that Susan B. Anthony was a great writer and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was a great orator, and so they made a great team. Lucy Stone from Massachusetts, along with some others, organized the Boston-based American Women's Suffrage Association. Lucy Stone attended Oberlin and was the first woman in Massachusetts to earn a college degree. She was asked to write a commencement speech, but she declined the honor because even though she would write the speech, it would have to be delivered by one of her male colleagues, women still being prevented from making public address. It's said that years later, Oberlin asked her back to make a commencement speech. In 1850, Stone was a leader in organizing the first National Women's Rights Convention in Worcester, Massachusetts. Remember, we talked about the 1848 convention, but that was on a more local level. And this one in Worcester drew women from a much wider sphere. Lucy Stone is remembered especially for one particular first. She was the first woman to retain her maiden name after marriage, which cost her no little bit of grief when she went to go run for the school board. I think it was in Cambridge where she was living. They refused to let her be considered or run for the spot unless she used her husband's name. While we're talking about women who are related in some way to Massachusetts, I just want to talk a little bit about Victoria Claflin Woodhall, pictured on the left. She was descended from the Claflin family that's up in Wenham, Massachusetts. It's actually an antique house called the Claflin House that still stands today. She was, she had an extremely colorful life. She established the first stock brokerage for women. She advocated free love. She was an actress, a spiritualist, and she ran for president, kind of. She didn't meet the minimum age requirement, and she didn't really campaign, and she wasn't on any state's ballots, but she did kind of run. The next woman who really did run is pictured on the right. She's Belleville Lockwood. She was from upstate New York. She was the first woman to be admitted to the Supreme Court bar, and she ran in 1884 and again in 1888, and she garnered votes in both elections. And this is what some men thought of her, her candidacy. Men would conduct these what were called Mother Hubbard parades, in which they were campaigning or, in support of, tongue-in-cheek, Belva's candidacy. They would put on nightgowns and bonnets and parade through the streets. In 1874, the Women's Christian Temperance Union formed, and in addition to becoming a very powerful voice against the evils of liquor, they also were an important force in the fight for suffrage. Not surprisingly, the liquor industry was not in favor of women getting the right to vote, their fear being that if women could vote, they would outlaw liquor consumption. In 1878, a women's suffrage amendment was introduced in the United States Congress, but it didn't pass. It is interesting to note, though, we're going to look at this map here, that many individual states did pass some sort of suffrage legislation far earlier than 1920. So in the olive states on the right, mostly on the right, in those states, women had no voting rights whatsoever. In the light orange states, which are kind of more in the northern area, Iowa and such, women could vote in the presidential election. In the dark orange states, Arkansas and Texas, women could vote in the primaries. And in the blue states, mostly out west, women had complete suffrage, probably for a couple of reasons. Women were an integral part of opening up the frontier, and therefore, were considered a very important element in that frontier opening. And also, it was probably an inducement for women to want to go out west. If they came out to help settle the frontier, then they would be given the right to vote. However, despite this map, suffragists felt that nothing short of a constitutional amendment was going to guarantee them their full rights. In 1890, the organization that split in two was reunited under the leadership of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but she was considered controversial and perhaps a little too rebellious, and so she resigned as president just a couple of years later. Now, you might think that every woman would have been in favor of women getting the right to vote, but this was not the case. In 1911, the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage formed, and it was formed by a group of influential and wealthy women, backed by many Catholic clergy, some corporate capitalists and wealthy business owners, and also by the the distillers and breweries and such. Also, Southern congressmen, if you remember, those olive states, a lot of them were down in the South, so the South was more conservative. Up in Wenham, Massachusetts, on February 6, 1912, the headline emblazoned across the front was, "Wenham women oppose suffrage." So why would people oppose suffrage? Well, here's a poster depicting what would happen if a woman had the right to vote. Posters and pamphlets were distributed that showed this sort of what would happen. You can see holes in the stockings, the lamp oil has run out, there's dirty clothes and probably nothing to eat in the kitchen either. The reasons were varied for why people felt that, some people felt that women should not be allowed to vote. Among them, no woman who may vote will attend to her domestic duties, as we just saw in that poster. It will make dissension between husband and wife. Or conversely, men and women are so much alike that men can represent women's views. Women will vote as her husband tells her to. Or probably what they were most worried about, women will form a solid party and outvote men. But my favorite is this one. Women have no powers of organization. I can hear you chuckling now. Despite this, in 1912, Theodore Roosevelt's Progressive Party became the first national political party to adopt a women's suffrage plank in the bid for the presidency. Finally, the suffragists were making some real headway, some real political headway. But Roosevelt was not elected. Woodrow Wilson was elected, and he was anti-suffrage. During the early teens, the National Women's Party organized hunger strikes and picketing. At first, Wilson was tolerant, but eventually he ordered the protesters jailed, where they received much publicized ill treatment, forced feedings, beatings, and such. It became an embarrassment to the White House, and ultimately those jailed were released. The United States entered World War I in 1917, and almost immediately the Wilson administration called on women to support the war effort. All over the country, women massed behind the war. Thousands of women volunteered their services. They joined drives to sell Liberty bonds and war savings stamps in order to allow the government to finance the war. Women sold war bonds in club meetings and on street corners. Others helped the Red Cross to provide medical supplies and provide other services to the military. And yet others worked in government agencies. Were one of the very numerous wartime women's volunteer associations. Thousands of female volunteers had for the first time the chance to wear Red Cross and other uniforms that marked them as people of knowledge and influence and skill. Thousands more had the unprecedented opportunity to serve in the military, as for the first time, women were allowed to enlist in some areas of the armed services. During the fall of 1917, the United States Employment Services recognized that thousands of women would have to work in the war industries. Women came out of their homes to do the jobs and provide the services that their country needed. By the winter of 1917-1918, it was clear that women would have to come out and do the jobs thought of as men's work. And right here is a picture of women in a welding shop. Now, in the view of the suffragists, the fact that women were being called upon to support the war effort and their country in such important ways further reinforced the argument to give women the vote. The National American Suffrage Association, under the direction of Carrie Chapman Catt, pictured here, formed a plan to, coordinate nationwide suffrage lobbying on the state and federal level, employing men's tactics of meeting with politicians and other influential people and leveraging those in favor to work on their constituents to bring them around as well. In 1918, Wilson came around to their point of view and urged and encouraged the Senate to pass the amendment, saying it was an act of right and justice to the women of the country and of the world. But it failed to pass. Finally, in 1919, it did pass, but it needed to be ratified by at least 36 states. 35 states ratified it, and then all eyes turned to Tennessee. As you might remember, on the state map we looked at earlier, Tennessee was one of those states that granted no rights, no voting rights for women. The vote looked to be extremely close, and there was no clear winner. The fight was on, and it was known as the War of the Roses. Those opposed to suffrage wore red roses. Those in favor of suffrage wore yellow roses. The swing vote was in question, and it was held by Harry Byrne, a young representative. And when I say young, he was 23, 24 years old. His earlier actions and statements, being a young man, had conflicted. It seemed likely that because he was young and new, that he would follow his party and vote with his constituency against the amendment. And as a matter of fact, he might have done just that, had it not been for a letter from his mother. Feb Byrne was an independent-minded widow caring for a farm in Tennessee, but she found time to keep up on the progress of the suffrage movement. And she said that recent news about the uncertainty of the outcome finally compelled her to sit down and write to her son, voicing her sentiments. "Hurrah and vote for suffrage, and don't keep them in doubt," wrote Feb. "I noticed Chandler's speech. It was very bitter. I've been waiting to see how you stood, but have not seen anything yet. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat with her rats. Is she the one that put rat in ratification? Ha, no more from Mama this time. With lots of love, Mama." And so, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. Now, I'm often asked, and so I've added just one slide here, how the United States compares to other countries. That could be an entire presentation all by itself. But I just have a little bit of information about that. In the 18th century, Swedish and Polish women who paid taxes were allowed to vote, although Sweden later rescinded that right. In the 19th century, Finnish tax-paying women were granted municipal voting rights, and later in 1906, they were the first women to be granted complete universal suffrage. Late in the 19th century, women in the UK were granted local voting rights, but they were not given universal suffrage until 1928. Many countries came in ahead of the United States, including Poland, Denmark, Austria, Belgium, and New Zealand. Others came in after the United States, the UK, as we've just said, South Africa, France, Greece, and it's continued on into the 21st century with Oman and Kuwait just more recently giving women some voting power. So what happened next? Well, let's switch gears completely and talk about fashion and its role as an indicator of the transformation. Between 1900 and the mid-20s, the feminine ideal in America underwent a remarkable and complete metamorphosis. At the turn of the century, the Gibson Girl, pictured here, defined the age. The phrase was made popular by Charles Dana Gibson, who was an illustrator. The Gibson Girl was defined by long hair swept up, displaying a high brow. She had a narrow waist, well-concealed legs, and a wifely and maternal manner. The Gibson Girl always appeared aloof and seemingly incapable of any immodest or irregular thought or deed. She was cultured, she was intelligent, but she wouldn't mix in politics and the like. By the 1920s, the Gibson Girl had vanished, and in her place was the flapper. Quite unlike the Gibson Girl, the flapper cut off her hair, concealed her curves, de-emphasized her curves and concealed her forehead, kept as much of her leg in plain view as possible. She wore plenty of makeup, something the Gibson Girl would not have dreamed of doing. In general, complete and utter metamorphosis. During the first half of the 20s, skirt length became the boiling point of this social revolution. Since 1915, skirts had been drifting slowly up until just about the end of World War I. They were about 6 to 7 inches off the ground. By 1920, all restraint had been thrown to the wind, and they were up another 5 to 6 inches. And it wasn't just skirt length. An entire ensemble was lightened and simplified. There were no more petticoats and chemises and corsets and such. The Journal of Commerce in 1928 declared that the amount of fabric needed for a woman's ensemble dropped from 19.5 yards in 1913 to 7 yards in 1928. The 1920s also witnessed an explosion of beauty shops, going from 5,000 in 1920 to 40,000 in 1930. Sales of cosmetics in that same time period jumped 400%. While women's expanding political opportunities contributed to the sense of the new woman, changes in work were really equally important. World War I brought short-term opportunities for a variety of jobs for women. And in addition, new business technologies like typing and stenography vastly increased the number of clerical jobs. Women flocked to white-collar work over blue-collar work. It was better paid than factory labor, and clerical work became increasingly dominated by women. And then they started to move into other positions such as bookkeeping and such. More than 88,000 women were employed as telephone operators, and by 1917, women accounted for 99% of all switchboard operators. Now, at the turn of the century, young working women had most often lived at home or as boarders with other families. So once they got out of school and before they married, they'd either live at home or they might board with a local family if they were working a little too far away. In the 1920s, between school and marriage, they lived in their own apartments, often sharing them with other young working women. Having their own apartments gave these young women a sense of autonomy and adulthood and being unsupervised and unrestrained. It gave their parents a lot of worry, with good reason. Jazz was all the rage. And the newspaper, the New York American, reported its results on the national character, saying moral disaster is coming to hundreds of young American girls through the pathological, nerve-irritating, sex-exciting music of jazz orchestras. In just 2 years in Chicago alone, according to the Illinois Vigilance Association, the downfall of 1,000 girls could be traced directly to the pernicious influence of jazz. A social worker reported on the unwholesome excitement she encountered at even small town dances in the Midwest. Boy and girl couples left the hall in a state of dangerous disturbance. Bathtub gin, combined with jumpy jazz music, suggestive couples dances, and short skirts all led to a new era of relaxed sexual norms. Rudolph Valentino, pictured here, made millions of women swoon, branded shake condoms. You can see the tins of those at the bottom of the screen. Well, these shake condoms held all the promise of romantic, Valentino-esque liaisons. One father of the time described his experience thus: "I was sure my girls had never experimented with a hip pocket flask, flirted with other women's husbands, or smoked cigarettes. My wife entertained the same smug delusion and was saying something like that out loud at the dinner table one day. And then she began to talk about a girl my daughter associated with, saying, 'They tell me that Purvis girl has cigarette parties at her home.' My daughter Elizabeth was regarding her mother with curious eyes. She made no reply, but turning to me right there at the table, she said, 'Dad, let's see your cigarettes.' Without the slightest suspicion of what was forthcoming, I threw Elizabeth my cigarettes. She withdrew one from the package, tapped it on the back of her left hand, inserted it between her lips, reached over and took my lighted cigarette from my mouth, lit her own cigarette, and blew airy rings toward the ceiling. My wife nearly fell out of her chair, and I might have fallen out of mine had I not been momentarily too stunned. Young working women often modeled their behavior and their dreams on the movies. In the 1920s, movie stars replaced political, business, and artistic leaders as role models for young people. And ironically, the movies in turn based their themes on the lives of young working women. After all, these young working women made up a large part of their audience. Films showed office workers and department store clerks working among wealthy male bosses and some customers as well. According to the movies, through spunk and cleverness, you could use your position to marry the boss. In 1928, 39% of college graduates were women, up from 19% at the turn of the century. That same year, women began to compete in track and field events in the Olympics. The first Olympics, held in 1896, women were not invited to participate in. The official line being that their competition would be impractical, uninteresting, unaesthetic, and incorrect. They began competing in the 1900 Olympics in lawn tennis and golf. And women's swimming was added in 1912. However, American women did not compete in that first event in 1912 because America required that their athletes wear skirts. And it's very difficult to swim in a skirt. So throughout all of this, women were enjoying new freedoms and opportunities. Let's take a kind of a fun look at what this all looked like. It looks like fun. Of course, the giddiness of the 1920s couldn't last with the stock market crash and the subsequent depression through the 30s. Even some ground was lost as some states passed laws preventing women from taking jobs, feeling that any jobs that they took, they were taking away from men. But at the same time, there were gains made in other areas. Frances Perkins, as Secretary of Labor, became the first woman cabinet member. Jane Addams became the first woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt forever changed the role of First Lady. Then came along World War II, and many women signed up to go overseas and to support their country's war effort yet again. And so we come back around to the foreshadowing words of Abigail Adams when she wrote, "If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not be bound, hold ourselves to be bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." How right she was, as we've seen the incredible evolution that could never have been possibly imagined by Abigail, or maybe even those first women at that convention in 1848. It was a long road, but with much perseverance over the decades, so by so many different women continuing the struggle and the fight, women eventually did win the right to vote, to work in a wide variety of careers, to wear what they wish, to do what they wish, and to gain a new level of independence that could just not have possibly been imagined by these first women when they began the struggle. Now women have established themselves and continue to establish themselves as a powerful political, economic, and cultural force. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ann. That was very good. Virtual program and tape rebroadcast by the Shrewsbury Cable Channels 28 and 328. Our next meeting will be December 16th, 2020. Popular Music in the Gaslight Era by John Root. So I hope to see everyone in December. Thank you.